At 0612 hours on November 2nd, 1943, Private First Class Raymond Doyle Givens pressed his cheek against a wooden stock that half his battalion had already written off as a museum piece. He was 22 years old, lying flat in a cane field on the island of Bougainville, Solomon Islands chain, and staring through a 2.5 power Weaver scope at a distance of 620 yards. 620 yards of broken terrain, elephant grass, and Pacific morning haze stood between him and a Japanese artillery officer who had, for the past 9 days, been directing fire that had killed 27 Americans. The rifle beneath Givens's hands was a bolt-action Springfield Model 1903 A4. Around his neck, instead of a standard dog tag, he wore a second tag stamped with a single designation: Sniper. That in a battalion equipped almost entirely with semi-automatic M1 Garands, his bolt-action rifle had earned him 3 nicknames, none of them flattering. His sergeant had called it a relic. His lieutenant had called it a liability. The battalion armorer, a former gunsmith from Allentown, Pennsylvania, had once looked at the 1903 A4, looked at Givens, and said simply, "Why?" Givens exhaled half a breath, held it, he squeezed the trigger. The story of American military marksmanship is not a story of steady progress. It is not a story of institutional wisdom or visionary planning. It is a story of stubbornness, of ridicule, of individual soldiers who believed in a weapon and a skill that their own army had, for decades, decided it did not need. Yet it is the story of how the United States military arrived at the Second World War with one of the weakest dedicated sniper programs of any major fighting force, and how, through the determination of a few quiet men carrying a rifle most of their comrades dismissed, that began to change. To understand what Givens was doing in that cane field, and why his rifle mattered, you have to go back to 1918. Part 1. The Lesson That Didn't Stick. The trenches of the Western Front produced 2 enduring lessons about modern warfare. The first was that machine guns and artillery dominated the open battlefield. The second, learned more painfully, more personally, was that a single skilled rifleman with a scope could paralyze an entire sector. German snipers in the First World War were systematic, professionally trained, and extraordinarily effective. Operating in pairs, using purpose-built rifles fitted with high-quality optics, they targeted officers, observers, and machine gun crews with a precision that bordered on industrial. British units in particular suffered devastating losses. The phrase "sniper's alley" entered military vocabulary not as hyperbole, but as a literal description of communication trenches, where movement during daylight hours meant death. The Americans entered the war late enough to feel this. Units of the American Expeditionary Forces reported consistent casualties from German precision fire at ranges exceeding 500 yards, ranges at which their standard-issue Springfield 1903 rifles, without optics, were essentially useless for return fire. American officers requested sniper training programs. Some were established, and a handful of American sharpshooters were trained in rudimentary camouflage, fieldcraft, and the use of scoped rifles. They proved effective. Then the war ended, and the United States Army, as it had done after nearly every conflict in its history, demobilized at speed and discarded most of what it had learned. By 1920, the dedicated sniper programs were gone. The rifles were in storage. The training doctrine was shelved. The institutional logic was straightforward, and it was wrong. The next war, planners believed, would be a war of movement, not trenches. Snipers were a trench warfare specialty. Snipers, therefore, were unnecessary. This assumption would cost American lives in numbers that were never fully tallied. Through the 1920s and 1930s, an American competitive shooting culture maintained a tradition of long-range marksmanship that the military itself had abandoned. The National Rifle Association, founded in 1871, partly in response to the poor marksmanship of Union soldiers in the Civil War, continued to sponsor matches at distances out to 1,000 yards. Camp Perry, Ohio, hosted the national matches every year. Civilian shooters and bolt-action rifles fired groups at 600 yards that military planners would have found astonishing. If those planners had been paying attention, which most were not, the rifles these civilians used told a story of their own. By the mid-1930s, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company had developed what would become the standard against which American bolt-action rifles were measured for the next 40 years. The Winchester Model 70, introduced in 1936, was not a military rifle. It was built for hunters and competitive shooters. It featured a controlled round-feed Mauser-style action, a claw extractor that gripped cartridge rims with a mechanical certainty that ejected spent brass regardless of the shooter's angle or movement. It was available in multiple calibers. It was finished to a standard that military procurement officers, looking at the price tag, found fiscally objectionable. But it shot. With factory ammunition, a well-made Model 70 in .30-06 Springfield caliber could group 5 shots inside 3 inches at 300 yards. With hand-loaded ammunition and a quality scope, the same rifle, in the hands of a competent shooter, could keep 5 rounds inside 6 inches at 600. In 1936, that was not a theoretical figure. It was being demonstrated, repeatedly, by American civilian competitors who had never served a day in uniform. The military's response was to proceed with the M1 Garand. The M1 Garand was, by any fair assessment, a remarkable engineering achievement. John Garand's design gave the American infantryman a semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger, compared to the bolt-action cycle that limited a trained rifleman to roughly 15 aim shots per minute. In volume of fire, the M1 Garand represented a generational leap. When the Army adopted it in 1936 and began issuing it to infantry units in the late 1930s, American soldiers carried more individual firepower than any equivalent force in the world. The problem was the scope. You could not mount a conventional telescopic sight on the M1 Garand, should the en-bloc clip system that fed ammunition into the receiver ejected the entire empty clip upward and to the right with a distinctive metallic ping, a sound famous enough that post-war mythology claimed the Japanese learned to listen for it. The ejection cycle, combined with the gas-operated action, made the receiver geometry incompatible with conventional scope mounting. The M1 Garand was a brilliant infantry weapon. As a precision platform for a man who needed to shoot a specific target at 600 yards, it had fundamental mechanical limitations. The Army's solution, when it finally addressed the problem, was to take the old Springfield 1903 action, the same bolt-action design that had served American riflemen since 1903, strip it down, modify the receiver to accept a scope rail, and call it the 1903 A4. And it was issued with a Weaver 330C scope, a 2.5 power optic that had been designed as a hunting scope. The whole assembly weighed 9.75 pounds unloaded. The scope had no adjustment markings on the turrets. Zero it at a given range, and you worked the rest by estimation. The iron sights were removed entirely. If the scope took a hit and failed, the rifle became functionally useless at any range where a sniper would logically be operating. Officers who examined the 1903 A4 in the early months of American involvement in the Second World War had a range of reactions. Some appreciated the precision it offered. More were skeptical. A bolt-action rifle, in a war that had already demonstrated the dominance of automatic weapons? A single-power hunting scope? No backup iron sights? Yet the rifle felt like a compromise made by a committee that had never fired a shot in anger. Raymond Givens received his 1903 A4 at Camp Lejeune in the spring of 1943. He was not part of the Marine Corps. He was Army, attached to the 3rd Marine Division for training purposes, as part of an experimental joint service program that had been quietly authorized and just as quietly ignored at the unit level. His introduction to the rifle was delivered by a Marine gunnery sergeant named Elroy Tatum, who had spent 2 years on the range at Quantico before shipping out. Tatum did not mince language. "This rifle," Tatum said, holding the 1903 A4 at arm's length, as though inspecting a piece of suspect produce, "is not a good rifle. It is not a bad rifle. It is a rifle that will do exactly what you make it do, and nothing more. And it will not compensate for your laziness. It will not cover for your impatience. It is a precision instrument that has been issued to you because someone in Washington finally noticed that we have been getting men killed at 500 yards and nobody on our side can hit back. Your job is to make that stop." Givens was from Harlan County, Kentucky. He had grown up in a household where the evening meal frequently depended on what a single point, .22 rimfire cartridge could accomplish in the hands of a boy who could not afford to miss. He had been shooting since he was old enough to hold a rifle steady. His father had taught him to read wind in the way that farmers read weather, not by instruments, but by observation, by the movement of grass, by the drift of wood smoke, by the slight shimmer of heat above a dark field. By the time he was 16, Givens was winning county matches with a borrowed rifle at ranges that surprised men twice his age. The Army had not specifically selected him for sniper training because of any of this. He had been assigned to the program because a sergeant in his basic training company had noticed, on a qualification range in Georgia, that Givens fired a perfect score without appearing to try. The sergeant had said nothing at the time. 3 weeks later, Givens received transfer orders. He did not know what he was being transferred to. The paperwork said Special Marksmanship Instruction. In 1943, the Army's sniper program did not yet have an official name that anyone was proud of. The training itself was 3 weeks long. In the European theater, British sniper courses ran 6 to 8 weeks and covered camouflage, observation, range estimation, stalking, and intelligence gathering in addition to marksmanship. German sniper training was similarly comprehensive. American sniper training in 1943 covered marksmanship, basic camouflage, and fieldcraft in a program that many instructors privately acknowledged was less preparation than improvisation. The institutional commitment simply did not exist. Resources were limited. The rifle was already a subject of internal debate. Givens shot his way through the marksmanship portion without difficulty. The camouflage instruction interested him more, the way a man could disappear into terrain by understanding not what he looked like, but what the terrain expected. His instructor, a former elk hunter from Wyoming named Sergeant First Class Burt Haskell, taught him to move at the speed of the environment. The ground doesn't rush," Haskell said. "You don't rush." It was Haskell who first put into words what experienced long-range marksmen understood and struggled to explain: that precision shooting at distance was not primarily a physical skill. The physical component, trigger control, breath management, natural point of aim, could be drilled into a competent shooter in a matter of weeks. What could not be drilled in was patience, the ability to wait, to observe, to understand that the shot itself was the smallest part of the problem, and that everything before the shot, the movement to position, the study of terrain and wind, the identification of the specific human being among many who represented the highest priority target, was where the actual work happened. "Any man can pull a trigger," Haskell said during one evening session, cleaning his own rifle at a field table while trainees listened. "A trained man can pull a trigger accurately. A sniper decides which trigger to pull, and when, and whether to pull it at all. That's a different skill set entirely." Givens graduated from the program ranked first among 11 trainees. He was assigned to the Army's 37th Infantry Division as a battalion-level asset, meaning he reported nominally to battalion headquarters, operated with considerable independence in the field, and was, in practice, largely misunderstood by the officers who technically commanded him. His immediate superior for operational purposes was a lieutenant named Chester Warfield, who had never attended any training related to sniper employment, and who, upon first examining the 1903 A4, had described it to Givens as that old bolt gun. Warfield was not unusual. The problem was systemic. By the time American ground forces engaged Japanese forces in the Pacific with any regularity, Guadalcanal beginning in August 1942, then the island-hopping campaign that followed, the tactical doctrine for employing snipers had not meaningfully evolved from its skeletal 1943 training program basis. Infantry officers at the company and battalion level had received no instruction in how to use a trained sniper, where to position one, or how to identify the targets that justified his specific skills. Snipers were frequently deployed as ordinary riflemen, their precision capability wasted. Others were assigned to positions that offered good fields of fire, but no viable targets, or viable targets but no concealment. Yet the institutional logic that had dismissed sniper training in the 1920s had not been replaced by anything coherent. It had simply been papered over by the urgency of a war that needed to be fought. The Japanese, by contrast, had invested in marksmanship programs that exploited exactly this gap. Japanese snipers in the Pacific operated with a patience and fieldcraft that consistently surprised American units, encountering them for the first time. They used cover with a sophistication born of training that was uncomfortable to acknowledge. Tree positions, camouflaged ground hides, abandoned structures with pre-cut firing ports. Their rifles, the Type 97 and Type 99, with the 2.5 power. Type 97 scope were not technologically superior to the American 1903A4. In many respects, they were inferior. The Type 97 scope mounting was fragile, and the rifles themselves varied considerably in quality as wartime production pressures increased. The Japanese sniper advantage in the early Pacific campaigns was not equipment. It was doctrine, patience, and the fact that their opponents had neither a systematic counter nor a systematic response. American casualties from Japanese precision fire in the Pacific's early island campaigns were statistically obscured within the larger losses of the fighting, but at the unit level the effect was visceral and specific. A Japanese sniper firing from a concealed position could, in a morning's work, kill the officer who crossed an open space, the radio operator whose antenna marked him, and the sergeant who knelt to examine the fallen officer. 3 losses, none of them random, all of them carefully chosen. Yet the effect on small unit cohesion and leadership continuity was disproportionate to the body count. Givens arrived on Bougainville in late October 1943 with the 3rd Marine Division's landing at Empress Augusta Bay, attached to Army elements following the initial Marine assault. The island was a different environment from any training he had experienced. Dense jungle canopy that limited visibility to 50 yards in most directions. Humidity that made the rifle's wooden stock swell against the metal fittings. And a Japanese defensive posture that had adapted its fieldcraft to exactly this terrain. The enemy was invisible in the way that only men who have thoroughly studied their ground can be invisible. They were not hiding. They were part of the landscape. His first 2 weeks on Bougainville, Givens fired his rifle twice, but both shots missed. Not by margin. The first shot was a wind call error at 340 yards that put the bullet 6 inches right of his intended point of impact. The second was a range estimation error at a target partially obscured by vegetation at an estimated 450 yards. 2 misses. In a sniper's accounting, 2 misses in 2 weeks was not a failure rate, but it was not a success rate either. And in a battalion where the private consensus held that the man with the bolt-action hunting rifle and the scope was either eccentric or wasteful of ammunition that could be better employed in an M1 Garand, it did nothing to change minds. Lieutenant Warfield suggested, in what he clearly intended as a helpful spirit, yet that Givens might benefit from carrying the standard issue Garand for situations where volume of fire becomes necessary. Givens thanked him and continued carrying the 1903 A4. The artillery officer, the man Givens would eventually shoot on the morning of November 2nd, was identified not by observation but by signal intelligence, passed down through channels that rarely reached the battalion level. His designation in the intelligence summary was simply Forward Observer, Enemy artillery battery. Grid reference, approximate. 9 days of Japanese artillery fire had targeted American supply lines and forward positions with a precision that indicated not simply good guns, but good eyes. Someone who was moving through the terrain, identifying targets, adjusting fire. The effects were measurable: 27 dead, 41 wounded. There were 3 significant supply caches destroyed. Battalion intelligence had a general area, a grid reference 3 kilometers square. In that 3-kilometer square were jungle, scrub, a secondary road that the Japanese used for resupply under the cover of darkness, 2 abandoned plantation outbuildings, and an unknown number of Japanese infantry. Givens was given the grid reference and told, in language that was polite enough on the surface but carried a clear implication of skepticism, that if he thought he could find anything useful there, he was welcome to try. He studied the grid reference on a map that was accurate to approximately 200 meters. He looked at aerial photographs, 3 of them taken from altitudes that made fine detail speculative. He talked to 2 Marine scouts who had operated on the eastern edge of the grid 3 days earlier and had seen nothing specific, but had noticed a trail of broken vegetation consistent with regular human movement along a creek line running roughly north to south through the center of the target area. He slept for 4 hours. At 01:45 hours on November 1st, Givens moved out alone into the Bougainville jungle. Part 2, Into the Green. The decision to work alone was not casual. British sniper doctrine of the period prescribed pairs. A shooter and a spotter who shared the observation burden, doubled the available eyes, and provided a measure of security that a single man could not. American doctrine, to the extent it existed, agreed. As Sergeant Tatum at Camp Lejeune had drilled the 2-man team concept with an emphasis that bordered on absolute, Givens had no spotter available. The Marine scout who might logically have partnered with him was recovering from a foot injury sustained 4 days earlier. The 2 Army scouts in his battalion were tasked to a separate operation that same night. Lieutenant Warfield had suggested, without apparent irony, that perhaps a rifleman from one of the line companies could accompany him. Givens considered this, a line infantryman, however willing, who had not been trained in the specific requirements of moving silently, freezing on command, controlling breathing and heart rate under observation, in jungle, at night, in Japanese-held territory, was not an asset. He was a liability. More noise, more movement, more chance of compromise at the worst possible moment. He left alone. The movement to the creek line took 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours to cover approximately 2 kilometers. In an open environment, 2 kilometers was a 20-minute walk. In jungle, at night, in territory that might hold Japanese security positions, it was an exercise in the reduction of every human impulse toward speed and efficiency. Givens moved at the pace of the environment. When something changed in the ambient sound of the jungle, the cessation of insect noise, the alarm call of a bird disturbed from a branch 50 meters ahead, he stopped, waited, listened, sometimes for 2 minutes, sometimes for 20. He found the creek line before dawn. The creek was approximately 4 meters wide at the point where he intersected it, a running clear and shallow over smooth stones. The banks were undercut in places, offering concealment for a man lying flat. The vegetation along the water was different from the jungle interior. More open at ground level, a canopy 10 meters overhead, filtered light that would, in a few hours, provide the kind of diffuse, directionless illumination that made a scope picture clean without creating the hard shadows that revealed position. He lay in the water on the eastern bank for the last 90 minutes before dawn and let the jungle accept him. This was the part that no training could fully convey, and that Haskell had tried to describe in terms that only made complete sense after you had done it. A human being in a natural environment is an anomaly. Animals and insects register anomalies instinctively. A Japanese sentry with trained senses could detect movement, smell, or the slight visual wrongness of a poorly concealed man. The counter to this was not camouflage, though camouflage helped. It was patience and stillness to the point where the jungle stopped registering you as an anomaly and began registering you as part of the background. At 0612 hours, as the light reached the level where his scope became functional, Givens saw the artillery observer for the first time. The man emerged from the tree line on the western bank, approximately 620 yards north along the creek, at a point where a small elevation gave a clear sight line southeast toward the American perimeter. He was carrying a radio and a map case. He was accompanied by a single rifleman who positioned himself at the tree line edge. Security kept watching back toward the Japanese rear, while the observer moved to the crest of the elevation and produced field glasses. Givens had 6 seconds to make a series of decisions. Range, 620 yards, estimated. His scope was zeroed at 300. At 620 yards with .30-06 M2 ball ammunition, the bullet would drop approximately 50 inches from a 300-yard zero. He had no adjustment markings to work from. The Weaver 330C offered no calibrated elevation system. He had a mental table of drop figures that Haskell had made him memorize. He had the feel of a dozen afternoons on the range, at 500 and 600 yards, working the relationship between holdover and impact. Wind, the creek ran north to south. The breeze was barely perceptible, moving from east to west. He could see it in the slight movement of a fern leaf at the water's edge, roughly a third of the distance to the target. Call it 3 miles per hour. At 620 yards, 3 miles per hour from 9 o'clock. Push the bullet approximately 8 inches left at impact. Target movement. The observer had stopped at the crest elevation. He was looking through his field glasses to the southeast. He was stationary. Givens settled the crosshairs at what his accumulated experience told him was the correct holdover point, approximately 22 inches of elevation above the target's center of mass, adjusted for the wind push. He took a breath, exhaled half of it. Let the natural respiratory pause arrive. And the Springfield 1903. A 4 had a trigger pull weight of approximately 5.5 pounds on the specimen he carried, heavier than ideal for precision work, something he had thought about requesting be adjusted and had not yet found the opportunity to address. He managed it by applying pressure with the pad of his trigger finger rather than the crease, increasing the lever advantage, reducing the tendency to disturb the aim on brake. He squeezed. The rifle moved in the way that a well-shot rifle moves, straight back, into the shoulder, no lateral disturbance. The recoil absorbed and managed. And he kept the scope on target through the shot for the half second it took the bullet to cover 620 yards. The observer went down. The rifleman at the tree line spun immediately, scanning. Givens did not move, not a muscle. And the creek water flowed around his legs. The insects had gone silent with the shot and would take perhaps 90 seconds to resume, a silence that any trained ear would note as meaningful. He counted it, watched the rifleman through his scope. The man was looking in the wrong direction, northwest, where the shot sound might have seemed to originate in the complicated acoustics of jungle. He was alert, competent, dangerous. And he was looking the wrong way. The 90 seconds passed. The insects resumed. Givens did not fire a second shot. He had been taught, and Haskell had been emphatic on this point, that a second shot from the same position against an alerted security element was a calculation with poor odds. The rifleman would adjust. The position would be compromised. The mission was complete. 1 shot, 1 result, and he lay in the creek for another 3 hours. Then, moving at the pace of the jungle, he went home. Part 3. The rifle they wouldn't acknowledge. He reported to Lieutenant Warfield at 1340 hours that afternoon. His uniform was wet to the waist. His face was painted with mud that had dried and cracked, and he smelled of creek water and the particular organic rot of Pacific jungle floor. He had been in the field for approximately 13 hours. His report was brief. Engagement at 620 yards. Single shot. Target acquired and taken down. No other casualties. He had observed the target for approximately 20 minutes before firing and was confident in the identification. The radio, the map case, the field glasses, the behavior consistent with a forward observer conducting a reconnaissance. Warfield listened, made a note, and asked whether Givens had been seen. Givens said he did not believe so. Warfield said that was good. He did not say anything else. The artillery fire on the American sector stopped that evening. It did not resume for 4 days, and when it did, it was less accurate. Adjustment calls that were working from general map references rather than direct observation. The change was quantifiable at the battalion level, noted in the daily intelligence summary, and attributed in the official record to disruption of Japanese forward observation capability. Raymond Givens was not mentioned by name in that summary. He was not recommended for recognition. He was not cited in any unit history produced during the campaign. At his shot, one of the longest confirmed engagements by an American sniper in the Pacific Theater, to that point in the war, existed primarily in a field report that Lieutenant Warfield filed without particular enthusiasm, and that was processed through channels with the bureaucratic indifference of a clerical routine. This was not exceptional. This was the American sniper experience in 1943. The institutional resistance to acknowledging what trained snipers could accomplish was not malicious. It was structural. Infantry officers who had been trained in a doctrine that did not include systematic sniper employment could not easily integrate the capability even when they had it. They did not know the questions to ask or the targets to prioritize. Yet they did not understand that a sniper's most valuable contribution was frequently not a body count, but a disruption. An artillery observer silenced, a communications relay denied, an officer's movement restricted to covered roads, that produced effects visible only in subsequent days, not in the immediate aftermath. The metrics that mattered in conventional infantry combat, ground gained, prisoners taken, enemy equipment destroyed, did not capture what a sniper provided, and the rifle itself remained a problem. The 1903 A4 had accumulating critics at every level above the individual shooter. Supply officers noted that it required different ammunition management than the standard Garand. The .30-06 cartridge was the same caliber, but the precision requirements meant that match grade, or at minimum, consistent lot ammunition was preferable to field distribution ball rounds pulled from general supply. Armory officers noted that the Weaver 330C scope, adequate for hunting at moderate ranges, was sensitive to the kind of rough handling that field conditions imposed. Scope failures in the Pacific, humidity, impact, the vibration of air transport, occurred at a rate that generated their own paperwork. The German answer to the precision rifle problem was different and instructive. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with the Karabiner 98K as its standard infantry rifle, also a bolt action, also capable of scope mounting, and had developed a layered system of optics that ranged from the ZF-41 pencil scope, a 1.5 power unit designed as a general enhancement rather than a precision instrument, to the high-quality ZF-4 and ZF-39 scopes used on dedicated sniper weapons. German sniper rifles were selected from production batches based on accuracy testing, then fitted with scopes adjusted to the individual weapon and sealed against field conditions. The system was not perfect, but it was systematic. The Soviet sniper program was, by 1943, arguably the most developed of any combatant nation. The Mosin Nagant with the Pu 3.5 power scope had been issued to trained snipers from the early months of the war in Soviet sniper doctrine, including the use of two-person teams, the systematic targeting of officers and NCOs, the operation in urban terrain, had been refined through 2 years of the most brutal infantry fighting the war produced. Names like Vasily Zaitsev and Lyudmila Pavlichenko had entered Soviet popular culture as heroes. The propaganda value was explicit and understood. Snipers were visible, celebrated, and institutionally supported. In the American Army, as of late 1943, the conversation about sniper doctrine had not progressed significantly beyond the argument about whether the rifle was worth carrying. The Marine Corps was moving in a different direction. The Marines, whose institutional culture had always taken marksmanship seriously, every Marine a rifleman was not a slogan but a training standard, had developed their own sniper program with somewhat more internal enthusiasm than the Army. Marine snipers in the Pacific used the Model 70 Winchester. In addition to the 1903 A4, the commercial hunting rifle having been purchased in limited quantities and found to deliver accuracy that the military production 1903 A4 could not consistently match. The Model 70's controlled round feed action was more reliable under adverse conditions. The triggers, not modified for military use, broke more cleanly. The barrels, produced to commercial hunting standards that were, in the specific case of the Model 70, actually superior to wartime military production barrels, shot tighter groups. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Tatum had carried a Model 70 himself, had never made a secret of his preference, had told Givens, during one of their extended conversations on the range at Camp Lejeune, that the difference between the best 1903 A4 and the best Model 70 was perhaps 10% at 400 yards and perhaps 20% at 600. 20% at 600 yards, Tatum had said, is the difference between the man going down and the shot going past his ear. Givens had asked why the Army didn't simply issue the Model 70. Tatum had laughed, not unkindly. Because the Army would have to admit that Winchester makes a better rifle than Springfield, and Springfield is a government arsenal, and somewhere in Washington someone would have to explain why they're buying commercial hunting rifles for the military, and that explanation would take longer than the war. This was not quite accurate. The procurement reality was more complex, but it captured the essential institutional inertia with precision. Military systems do not change quickly, and they change when the cost of not changing becomes undeniable. In late 1943, the cost was being counted in lives, but the accounting was obscured by the scale of the larger conflict. Part 4. The program that almost wasn't. The history of the American sniper program in the Second World War is, in significant part, a history of individuals who understood what needed to exist and spent the middle years of the war trying to make institutions listen. Captain Herbert McBride, a veteran of the First World War who had served with Canadian units before American entry and experienced German sniper operations firsthand, had written a book in 1935 called A Rifleman Went to War that described sniper tactics and techniques with a specificity unusual for a military memoir. The book found readers among competitive shooters and a small number of military officers, but no institutional response. Lieutenant Colonel William Jarrett, who would eventually oversee Army Ground Forces sniper training program, spent the early years of the war writing memoranda that progressed through channels with the bureaucratic velocity of a letter posted to an address that no one was quite sure existed. His argument was consistent. The Army had, during the First World War, developed practical knowledge of sniper employment and counter-sniper tactics. That knowledge had not been retained. The current war was reproducing, at tremendous cost, the lessons of 1918. A systematic program, proper training, appropriate doctrine, standardized equipment, an education of officers in sniper employment could reduce casualties and increase tactical effectiveness at minimal cost. The response to these arguments was not hostile. It was something more corrosive. It was indifferent. Senior officers who had formed their tactical thinking in the 1920s and 1930s, when the Army was small, underfunded, and focused on the theoretical requirements of a hypothetical future conflict, had not integrated precision marksmanship into their mental model of what battles looked like. You fought with artillery, with armor, with infantry and volume. Snipers were a niche, a specialty, something the Marines did. What finally moved the conversation was not argument, but arithmetic. By early 1944, casualty analysis from Pacific and North African campaigns had begun to accumulate in enough volume that specific patterns were visible. Units operating in terrain that favored concealed fire, jungle, mountain, urban rubble, were sustaining a disproportionate share of their casualties from what field reports consistently described as accurate individual fire at extended ranges. The effect on leadership was especially marked. Officers and NCOs were being killed at rates that suggested deliberate targeting rather than random distribution. This was not a new observation. It had been noted at the unit level from the earliest engagements. It had now finally accumulated enough cases to be visible to planners. Simultaneously, and the testimony of American officers who had fought alongside British and Commonwealth units returned a consistent message. British sniper employment in North Africa and later in the Italian campaign had demonstrated capabilities that American units in comparable terrain did not possess. British snipers working in pairs had interdicted German supply lines, neutralized artillery observers, and maintained psychological pressure on enemy positions that restricted movement and degraded morale. The suppression effect, the degree to which skilled snipers could limit enemy activity in a sector simply by their presence without necessarily firing, was quantifiable in reduced enemy patrols and supply movements during daylight hours. American officers who had witnessed this came home and said so, loudly, repeatedly. In 1943, Army Ground Forces published FM 2175, Scouting, Patrolling, and Sniping, which for the first time codified American sniper doctrine in a field manual. The manual was imperfect. Its training recommendations were still compressed by the standards of comparable Allied programs, and its guidance on equipment remained ambiguous. But its existence represented a formal acknowledgement that the Army needed snipers in a systematic way, not as individual eccentrics carrying bolt-action rifles that their officers called relics. The equipment question was partially resolved in 1943 and 1944, as experience in the field generated requirements that procurement officers could no longer ignore. The Weaver 3 30C scope on the 1903A4 was inadequate. The market offered better options. The Lyman Alaskan, at a 2.5 power scope designed for American hunting conditions, offered improved light gathering and a sturdier mechanical construction. The Unertl 8 power scope, used by Marine snipers and some Army units, offered magnification that allowed target identification and shooting at ranges where the 2.5 power Weaver was making every shot a confidence exercise. These scopes were procured in limited numbers, distributed unevenly, and cherished by the men who received them. Raymond Givens received a Lyman Alaskan scope as a replacement for his Weaver 330C in January 1944, during a period of relative operational quiet. The man who mounted it for him was a Marine armorer named Kozlowski, who had been fitting scopes on rifles since before the war and who spent 45 minutes with the 1903A4, adjusting the mounting rings with a precision that reminded Givens of his father fitting a stock to a rifle back in Harlan County. Kozlowski said almost nothing during the process except, near the end, to ask whether Givens knew what a scope shadow was and how to avoid it. Givens said he did. "Good," Kozlowski said. He handed the rifle back. "The Alaskan will serve you. Treat it like a person, not like equipment." It was the most useful piece of advice Givens received in 1944 that did not come from someone shooting at him. Expansion. The Korean Interlude. The war ended, and the lessons almost went with it. By 1946, the Army's sniper training programs had been suspended. The rifles were in storage. The doctrine manuals were on shelves. The men who had learned the trade, Givens, Haskell, and a dozen others whose names do not appear prominently in any official history, were civilians. The institutional cycle that had followed 1918 was repeating with mechanical precision. Conflict ended, specialized capabilities dissolved. The knowledge that had been so painfully accumulated was packed in crates, and the keys were given to someone who had other priorities. This was not cynicism, it was physics. Large organizations under peacetime resource pressure contract toward the mean. specialized capabilities that are expensive to maintain and whose value is difficult to quantify in the absence of active conflict. A sniper who is not actively sniping, produces no measurable output, are logical candidates for reduction. The logic was consistent. The consequences were consistent. Yet the consequences were paid for by men who would fight in Korea. The Korean War began in June 1950 with a North Korean armored push across the 38th parallel that caught American and South Korean forces in a state of readiness that reflected the peacetime institutional logic described above. The early fighting was defensive, desperate, and characterized by the same fundamental problems that had characterized the early Pacific campaigns. American forces encountering North Korean and later Chinese soldiers who had received training and doctrinal preparation that American planning had not anticipated and American equipment was not optimally configured to counter. The sniper dimension of this was specific and reported. North Korean snipers, trained on Soviet doctrine and equipped with Mosin-Nagant rifles and PU scopes, the same combination that had served Soviet snipers effectively on the Eastern Front, operated against American positions with a professionalism that unit reports described in terms that would have been familiar to anyone who had read the Pacific campaign records. Officers targeted, NCOs targeted, radio operators targeted. Fire adjusted to exploit cover gaps that soldiers, through repetition of movement, had inadvertently created. The American response, again, was delayed. The 1903 A4 was pulled from storage. The Lyman Alaskans and Uneartles that had survived the demobilization were found in warehouses and issued to men who had varying levels of training in their use. Some of the men receiving them had served in the Pacific and retained the skills. More of them had not served in the Pacific and received the rifles with the blank competence of a soldier accepting an unfamiliar tool and trying to understand it under operational pressure. The Korean War added its own specific demands to the sniper calculus. The terrain was different from the Pacific. Open ridge lines, deep valleys, the particular challenges of shooting across changing elevation gradients that complicated both range estimation and wind reading. The cold added mechanical variables. Lubricants thickened and temperatures that dropped to 20 and 30 below zero. Scope reticles could appear to shift as thermal differentials moved glass elements against each other. Bare skin touched to metal in those temperatures produced immediate damage. Marines in Korea developed cold-weather sniper techniques through the same mechanism that had driven most of the practical advancement in the program. Individual experience, trial and error. The transfer of specific knowledge between men who respected the problem and were willing to work it without institutional encouragement. A Marine sergeant in the 1st Marine Division named Bill Lambert, who had attended the limited sniper training available before deployment, spent the first months of the Korean conflict systematically testing what he had been told against what the mountains above the Chosin Reservoir demanded. And finding, not for the first time in this story, that what he had been told was approximately right and experientially incomplete. Lambert lived, he brought his corrections back. Yet he taught them informally to anyone who would listen, and formally to no one, because there was no formal structure for the teaching. This was still the American sniper experience in 1952. The Korean War armistice was signed in July 1953. Within 2 years, the sniper programs were again at minimal strength. Within 5 years, the accumulated experience of the Korean mountains was again primarily held by individual veterans, rather than by institutional doctrine. The cycle continued. Expansion. The rifle that waited. The Winchester Model 70, through all of this, was selling steadily to American deer hunters. Its reputation among the shooting community was, by the mid-1950s, essentially mythological. Competitive shooters who had used the pre-war Model 70 for long-range matches described a rifle whose mechanical virtues were simple to articulate and difficult to reproduce in other designs. The controlled round feed action, the claw extractor that gripped a cartridge from the moment it was stripped from the magazine, maintaining positive control through the entire feeding, chambering, and extraction cycle, was the feature that experienced shooters mentioned first. A Model 70 that was inverted, tilted, or held at any angle from horizontal would extract a fired case and feed a fresh round reliably. A spring-loaded plunger ejector, the alternative used by many designs, would sometimes allow a round to partially chamber under adverse conditions, enough to create a malfunction that, in a competition, was an annoyance, and in a combat situation was something else. The barrel quality was the second feature. Winchester's pre-1964 barrels were cut-rifled, a process slower and more expensive than the button rifling that had become standard for high-volume production, but one that left the steel in a stress-free state that translated, over the barrel's life, into more consistent accuracy and slower degradation. A cut-rifled barrel from Winchester in 1952 would, after 3,000 rounds of match ammunition, still shoot groups that would embarrass many production barrels fresh from the factory. The trigger, the stock inletting, the overall fit of metal to wood. These were details that Winchester's pre-1964 workforce, some of them craftsmen whose experience dated to the 1930s, treated as professional obligations rather than production variables. None of this was secret. Any experienced gunsmith in America could have told you in 1950 exactly why the pre-1964 Model 70 shot the way it did. Many of them did tell you, to anyone who asked. The information was published in gun magazines. It was discussed at Camp Perry. It was known. What it was not, until 1966, was official. The decision to adopt the Winchester Model 70 as the Marine Corps sniper rifle in 1966 was made by people who had done the work, who had tested the rifles, shot the groups, run the field trials, and arrived at a conclusion that every civilian competitive shooter with relevant experience could have told them in 1943. The institutional journey from "we know this" to "we have officially decided this" spanned a generation. The pre-1964 Model 70 production run had ended in 1963, when Winchester, under financial pressure and changing manufacturing economics, redesigned the rifle. The 1964 redesign used a different extractor system, a smaller spring-loaded design that was cheaper to manufacture and that the shooting community universally regarded as inferior to the original claw extractor. The 1964 Winchester was still a good rifle. By ordinary hunting rifle standards, it was adequate for any purpose a hunter might have. By the standards of the pre-1964 model it was replacing, it was a disappointment. The military's adoption of the Model 70 arrived, with fine institutional timing, after the rifle the military was adopting had been changed into something slightly less than what it had been. This prompted the Marines, in 1966, to prioritize acquisition of remaining pre-1964 inventory and to look carefully at what alternatives existed. The Remington 700, introduced in 1962, used a push-feed action, not the controlled round-feed Mauser design of the pre-1964 Model 70, but featured excellent barrel quality, a consistently good trigger, and a receiver design that accepted a wide range of commercial stocks. The Remington 700 became the basis for the M40 in 1966. The Model 70 served alongside the M40 for several years in Marine Corps inventory, the two rifles representing the last overlap of the civilian hunting tradition and the emerging purpose-built military sniper system. The men who carried them in Vietnam were the first generation of American military snipers to operate within a program that was, at last, systematic. Now, Part 5. The rifle finds its moment. The Winchester Model 70 entered the war in small numbers through channels that official procurement records do not fully illuminate. Some came through the Marine Corps, which had purchased commercial rifles with a practical directness that the Army's procurement bureaucracy could not match. Marine armorers had tested the Model 70 against the 1903 A4 in controlled conditions and found what competitive shooters had known since 1936. The Winchester shot better, and shot consistently better, across a range of ammunition types and environmental conditions. The pre-war Model 70, manufactured before wartime production pressures degraded tolerances, was a precision instrument that happened to look like a hunting rifle because it was, in fact, built to hunting rifle standards that had not been compromised by the economies of mass military production. Other Model 70s arrived through informal channels. Officers with connections to the hunting and shooting world quietly arranged for commercial rifles to be acquired and shipped to units that had the training to use them. This was not strictly irregular. Military necessity had generated similar arrangements throughout American military history. But it was not systematic either. A unit might have one Model 70, 2, occasionally 5. The distribution reflected personal relationships and individual initiative more than any coherent supply policy. The difference to a man shooting at 600 yards was not theoretical. The 1903 A4 in standard military configuration, with a barrel manufactured under wartime production, that would typically group 5 shots into approximately 4 to 5 inches at 300 yards with standard M2 ball ammunition. At 600 yards, that group expanded to approximately 12 to 15 inches. 12 to 15 inches at 600 yards meant that a man-sized target, roughly 18 inches wide across the chest, was within the rifle's capability on calm days with good ammunition and a good shooter. But margin was thin. Wind calls had to be right. Range estimation had to be accurate. The trigger had to be managed precisely. Everything had to be right. A well-made pre-war Model 70, with selected ammunition and a quality scope, shot groups of approximately 2 to 3 inches at 300 yards. At 600 yards, those groups ran 5 to 7 inches. The difference between a 12-inch group and a 6-inch group at 600 yards was not academic, yet it was the difference between shooting and hitting. Sergeant First Class Haskell, who had moved from training to operational duty with an Army Ranger unit by early 1944, wrote a brief memorandum to his battalion commander at some point in the Italian campaign that managed, in 3 pages, to articulate what years of procurement arguments had failed to convey. He had been issued a 1903 A4. He had, through circumstances he declined to specify in the memo, acquired a Model 70 in .30-06, fitted with an unertl 8-power scope. He had shot both rifles extensively under operational conditions in the mountains north of Casino. His assessment was blunt. The Springfield is an adequate instrument in the hands of a trained man. The Winchester is a superior instrument in the hands of the same man. At ranges above 500 yards in mountain terrain, the practical difference in first shot hit probability is meaningful. I estimate my first round hit probability with the Winchester against a stationary man-sized target at 600 yards, under moderate wind conditions at approximately 85%. With the Springfield under identical conditions, I estimate 65%. The 20% difference at distances where the enemy cannot readily identify the shooter's position represents the difference between the mission being accomplished and the shot being heard without result. 20%. The same figure Tatum had mentioned on the range at Camp Lejeune, now supported by operational experience from a different theater, a different terrain, a different set of conditions. The memorandum reached Haskell's battalion commander. The battalion commander passed it up, and it eventually arrived on the desk of an officer in Army Ground Forces who was, by early 1944, actively working to improve both the equipment and the doctrine of the American Sniper program. That officer's name was Major Harold Anderson, and Anderson had been fighting this particular institutional battle for long enough to recognize a useful piece of evidence when it landed on his desk. Anderson could not, in early 1944, simply mandate that the Army issue Winchester Model 70 rifles to its snipers. The procurement, logistics, and standardization implications of introducing a commercial hunting rifle as a military sniper weapon were real. The Model 70 would require different armorer training. Its commercial standard barrel threading was not compatible with military cleaning equipment. Its magazine was fixed, not detachable. Parts availability in forward areas would depend on supply lines calibrated for military weapons, not hunting rifles. These were solvable problems, but solving them required institutional will, and institutional will required institutional recognition that the problem existed and mattered. Anderson collected his evidence. He wrote his own memoranda. He found allies. He waited. The answer, when it came, was not the Winchester Model 70. It was something different. Part 6. The glass that changed everything. In the equipment calculus of the Second World War's sniper programs, the rifle was secondary to the scope. This was a conclusion that took several years to reach because it was, on its surface, counterintuitive. The rifle was visible, tangible, a piece of hardware with a lineage and a name. The scope was an accessory, an attachment, something that went on top of the rifle. The rifle was the weapon. The scope was the tool. Experienced snipers understood the relationship differently. The rifle was the mechanism by which energy was transferred from a powder charge to a bullet that moved in a predictable trajectory to a target. A good rifle mechanism was necessary. You needed reliable ignition, consistent lock time, a barrel that didn't vibrate unpredictably, a trigger you could control. But within a range of acceptable mechanical quality, rifles of similar caliber and barrel quality shot to similar standards. The scope was what allowed you to see the target, measure the conditions, make the decisions that determined whether the bullet went where it needed to go. A mediocre rifle with an excellent scope in trained hands, and outshot an excellent rifle with a mediocre scope. The Weaver 330C that had shipped with the initial 1903 A4 was a 2.5 power scope. At 600 yards, 2.5 power magnified the target to the apparent size of something 240 yards away. Better than the naked eye, but not the crisp, detailed image that allowed a shooter to read wind drift in the mirage shimmer above the ground, or to identify whether the human shape at the far end of the field of view was carrying a rifle or a rake. The Weaver's optics were adequate. The scope's reticle, a simple duplex crosshair, gave no indication of range or drop. The mechanics, adequate for a hunting rifle used in American conditions, were not designed for the humidity extremes, temperature cycling, and physical abuse of Pacific or European theater operations. The Lyman Alaskan was better, yet the Unertl was significantly better. 8 power offered a view that transformed the shooter's ability to identify and engage at extended ranges. But the Unertl was large, heavy, externally adjustable in ways that required careful handling in the field, and not designed for the quick handling that military operations sometimes demanded. What Anderson and his colleagues were working toward by early 1944 was a purpose-built military sniper scope that would combine adequate magnification, reliable mechanical adjustment, appropriate eye relief, and sufficient ruggedness for the conditions American snipers were actually operating in. This was not a dramatic innovation. The Germans had developed the ZF-4 scope along broadly similar lines, and in the Soviet PU scope had been serving adequately in the most demanding conditions on Earth. But it required the institutional commitment to make it happen. That scope, the M73B1, or Bear Cub, and its successors would arrive too late to equip more than a fraction of the snipers who fought in the war's final years. The procurement story was one of small numbers, uneven distribution, and the persistent gap between what doctrine specified and what supply chains delivered. Givens never received a purpose-built military sniper scope. He worked with the Lyman Alaskan for the remainder of his time in the Pacific, a period that extended through the Luzon campaign and the fighting on the Philippine main island from January through August 1945. The Alaskan served him. He learned its particular qualities, the way its image softened slightly in the first and last 20 minutes of usable light, requiring him to add mental certainty to optical ambiguity. The way the reticle appeared to shift slightly against a bright sky background. compared to a jungle canopy background, a phenomenon he compensated for by always finding a neutral background against which to align the crosshairs before acquiring the target. He became, across these months, something that training could approximate but not fully produce. He became a man who had shot enough, under enough different conditions, at enough different distances, in enough different states of physical exhaustion and mental pressure, that the mechanics of the process had receded from conscious management into something closer to instinct. He did not calculate. He estimated. He did not plan individual shots. He read situations. The difference was difficult to articulate to someone who had not experienced it. And Givens did not generally try to articulate it. He was not a man given to lengthy explanation. His confirmed engagements from Bougainville through Luzon totaled 41. The figure is not certain. Record-keeping for individual sniper engagements in the Pacific was inconsistent at best, and Givens himself kept no personal record. But 41 is the number that appears in the final assessment compiled from unit reports by a historian who interviewed Givens briefly in 1947. The number places him among the most effective American snipers of the Pacific Theater. It is not a number that appeared in any contemporary official recognition. He was promoted to sergeant in March 1944. He was awarded a Bronze Star in July 1944 for an engagement during the Leyte campaign, in which, according to the citation, he displayed extraordinary skill and composure under fire. The citation did not specify the nature of the engagement, the distance, or the conditions. It was written in the generic language that citation writers used when they were not entirely certain what had happened but knew it had been notable. He was never recommended for the Silver Star. He was never recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. The awards system, like the sniper doctrine system, had no well-developed mechanism for recognizing what a sniper specifically accomplished. The criteria were built around visible, immediate, dramatic action: charging a machine gun nest, rescuing a wounded man under fire, leading a charge. A man who lay in a creek for 3 hours and then fired one shot that changed the artillery situation for the next 4 days did not fit those criteria. Part 7. What the war finally learned. By the middle of 1944, the American military sniper program had improved enough to begin producing systematic effects and had failed sufficiently visibly that the improvements were accelerating. Both were true simultaneously. The improvements were real. Army ground forces had published revised sniper training standards that extended the program to 6 weeks and added coursework in observation, range estimation, map reading, and camouflage that previous iterations had given token attention. Marine Corps sniper training had been consistently stronger. Army training was now moving toward parity. New equipment, including the Lyman, Alaskan, and limited numbers of the Unertl, was reaching units in greater quantities. Officers' understanding of sniper employment was improving in the specific sense that veterans who had learned by experience were now in leadership positions that allowed them to educate younger officers, before those younger officers made the mistakes that had been standard in 1942 and 1943. The failures were also real. The equipment remained inconsistent. The training remained shorter than what comparable Allied programs offered. The institutional resistance had not vanished. It had moderated to a skepticism that acknowledged snipers were useful while continuing to resist the systematic commitment that would have made them more useful. And the rifle question had still not been fully resolved. Should the 1903-04 continued in service through the end of the war and into Korea? It was a serviceable precision platform. It was not the best available precision platform. The Winchester Model 70 remained in civilian gun cases and a limited number of Marine Corps armories, demonstrating shot by shot what a purpose-built precision rifle could deliver and being unavailable to most of the men who could have used it. The Army's answer to the precision rifle question in the late 1940s and early 1950s was, characteristically, to look at the weapons already in the inventory and ask how they could be adapted. The M1 Garand, which could not accept a conventional scope due to its operating mechanism, was a problem that generated a solution. The M1C and M1D sniper variants, which used offset scope mounts to clear the action. The offset mounting created a cant in the sight picture that required compensation. It worked. It was not elegant. It was what was available. The Winchester Model 70's moment with the American military would come. But not in the Second World War, and not for reasons that anyone who studied the 1903 A4 procurement arguments would have predicted. It came in Vietnam. In 1966, Marine Corps Captain Jim Land established a scout sniper school at Da Nang that would become the foundation of modern American military sniper doctrine. Land and his colleagues, drawing on the lessons of every conflict since 1918 and the extensive body of practical marksmanship knowledge that had accumulated in the shooting community, developed a training program and an equipment standard that took the institutional conversation out of the realm of argument and into the realm of evidence. The Marines tested rifles. They tested scopes. They tested ammunition. They produced results that were unambiguous. The rifle they selected was the Winchester Model 70 in .30-06 and later .308 Winchester caliber, fitted with an 8-power inertial scope. The same combination that Haskell had described in his memorandum from the mountains above Casino in 1944. The same combination that Marine Gunnery Sergeant Tatum had been quietly advocating since before the war. 20 years had passed. The rifle had not changed. The pre-1964 Model 70 was still regarded as the finest production bolt action available in America. The institutional resistance had worn down under the weight of 20 years of evidence. The Model 70 became the Marine Corps sniper rifle. It equipped the men who would, in Vietnam, produce the longest confirmed kills in American military history to that point. Carlos Hathcock, the Marine sniper who became the most celebrated American marksman of the war, used a Winchester Model 70 for much of his service. Though his most famous shot, a kill at approximately 2,500 yards, was made with a machine gun and scope. The Model 70 was not a machine gun, but it was accurate enough that in the hands of trained men, it redefined what American military marksmanship could accomplish. The rifle they had mocked was now the rifle they depended on. Septem Part 8. The Quiet Accounting. The story of the American sniper program between 1918 and 1966 is not, at its core, a story about rifles. Rifles are the visible element, the hardware around which arguments organize, the object that can be photographed and displayed and handed down. The actual story is about doctrine and institutional culture, about the gap between what individual experience demonstrates and what military institutions absorb, about how long it takes a large organization to integrate a lesson that any experienced practitioner could have taught in an afternoon. Raymond Givens understood this, or something close to it, without necessarily articulating it in those terms. He left the Army in the fall of 1945 with the rank of Staff Sergeant, a Bronze Star, and a 1903 A4 rifle that he had been allowed to keep under circumstances the paperwork did not fully explain. The rifle spent the next several years under his bed in a house in Harlan County, Kentucky, because he did not have a gun cabinet large enough to display it and had no particular inclination to display it in any case. He went back to work in the county, doing various things: road maintenance, some carpentry, a period of work in the coal mines that he later said he found the claustrophobia objectionable, and shot his rifles on weekends at distances that continued to astonish men in the county who did not know his history. He was not secretive about the history. He simply did not volunteer it. A local newspaper reporter, working on a veterans feature in 1947, tracked him down and asked about his wartime service. Givens spoke briefly, factually, without dramatics. He mentioned that he had served in the Pacific. He mentioned that he had been a sniper. He mentioned the Bougainville engagement and the artillery observer, because the reporter had somehow already learned about it and asked directly. He described the shot in approximately 4 sentences. The reporter wrote a feature that was 3 times as long as what Givens had told him and considerably more dramatic. Givens read it, said nothing, and went back to work. His rifle outlasted him by many years. He died in 1989 in Harlan County at the age of 68. The 1903 A4 went to a nephew who was a competitive shooter and who understood what he had. The rifle is currently in a private collection. The Lyman Alaskan scope that Koslowski mounted in January 1944 is still on it. And the question of whether Raymond Givens was, by any fair measure, one of the more significant American snipers of the Second World War is not one that official records allowed to be answered cleanly. Official records were inconsistent, incomplete, and organized around a system that had no proper category for what he had done. By the estimate of the historian who interviewed him in 1947, and by the account of men who served with him, the figure of 41 confirmed engagements placed him in the top tier of American Pacific theater snipers. By any comparative measure with Allied or enemy marksmen of the period, he was operating at a high level of skill in a program that was decades behind where it should have been. At the men who ran that program, Jarrett and Anderson and Haskell and Land and a dozen others who spent years trying to make institutions hear what experience was saying, eventually succeeded. The American military sniper program that emerged from Vietnam was comprehensive, doctrinally sound, and equipped with rifles and scopes that were finally purpose-built for the job. It was the program that should have existed in 1942. It existed, fully realized, by 1970. That is a span of 28 years. 28 years of lessons being learned, forgotten, relearned, and finally retained. 28 years of men carrying rifles that their officers called relics, and their armories called obsolete, and their supply sergeants called headaches. The rifles kept shooting. At Part 9, The Legacy in the Glass. The Winchester Model 70's role in defining American military sniper excellence did not end with Vietnam. The rifle's period as the standard Marine Corps sniper weapon ran from the mid-1960s through the adoption of the Remington M40 in 1966. The M40 itself being a Remington 700 action in a new stock, introduced in part because civilian demand for the pre-1964 Model 70 had been replaced by the post-1964 Winchester that used a different, widely criticized action design. The Model 70 that had won the argument had, in the way that manufacturing economics tend to resolve these things, been changed in ways that made it less than what it had been. The M40 and its successor variants served the Marine Corps into the 21st century. The Army adopted the M24 sniper weapon system, though based on a Remington 700 action in a Macmillan stock. In 1988, both rifles descended from the same lineage of controlled round-feed bolt actions, precision barrels, and quality triggers that the Model 70 had represented at its best. The argument about whether the American military should invest in purpose-built precision rifle systems for trained marksmen had, by the 1980s, been settled so completely that it was no longer an argument. It was a baseline assumption. The scopes had traveled farther still. The 2.5 Power Weaver that shipped with the 1903 A4 in 1943, the scope that couldn't tell you your range, gave you no calibrated adjustment, and fogged in Pacific humidity, had been replaced by first focal plane variable power optics with illuminated reticles. Tactical turrets, calibrated in milliradians or MOA, and in night vision capable designs that extended the shooter's effective window to conditions that would have seemed fantastical to a man lying in a creek on Bougainville at 0600 hours with a scope that fogged in the morning damp. The fundamentals had not changed. Stillness, patience, wind reading, range estimation, the management of a trigger through the precise application of controlled force at the moment when everything, breath, heartbeat, natural point of aim, aligned. These were the skills that Haskell had tried to describe in an Army training tent in 1943, that Tatum had drilled into trainees on a range at Camp Lejeune, that Givens had learned partly from instruction and partly from a father who had taught him that a .22 cartridge spent on a missed shot was a cartridge that couldn't be spent on dinner. The technology around those fundamentals had been transformed. The fundamentals themselves were older than the Republic. In the competitive shooting world, the Winchester Model 70, specifically the pre-1964 version with its controlled round-feed Mauser action, remained a benchmark against which modern production was measured. Collectors paid significant premiums for pre-1964 Model 70s in good condition. Custom gunsmiths used pre-1964 actions as the foundation for purpose-built precision rifles that competed at the highest levels of long-range shooting competition. The rifle that had been dismissed as a commercial hunting gun unworthy of military adoption was now a collectible and a working legend in the shooting community simultaneously. At Camp Perry, Ohio, where civilian competition shooters had been demonstrating, since the 1870s, that American marksmanship was capable of things that military planners consistently underestimated, the long-range events continued. Shooters with modern equipment, with data tables and laser rangefinders, and scopes worth more than a used car, shot at 1,000 yards. They shot well. They shot in a tradition that ran back through the men who had tried to tell the Army what precision rifles could do and been ignored, through the competitive shooters of the interwar years who had kept the knowledge alive when the institutions let it lapse, through the riflemen of 1918 who had first felt the specific educational experience of losing men to German precision fire and understood, viscerally, what it meant. The tradition was unbroken. The institution had been. Yet the institution had eventually been repaired by the same kind of individual determination that had always driven American marksmanship, men who knew what was true about a rifle and what was true about a skilled shooter, and who kept demonstrating that truth until the demonstrating could no longer be dismissed. Part 10. The Last Shot. The last entry in the field report record for Raymond Givens, dated August 9, 1945, describes an engagement near Appareé, on the northern coast of Luzon, at a distance of 490 yards. One round fired. The target, a Japanese forward positions communication relay operator, based on the equipment visible through the scope, was struck. The war in the Pacific ended 6 days later with the Japanese announcement of surrender. Givens fired no more shots in combat after August 9th. He was 24 years old. In the weeks that followed the surrender, while American forces in the Philippines organized for occupation duty and the machinery of peace ground into motion, with the same institutional momentum that the machinery of war had required to start, Givens found himself in a temporary camp with time that had no shape. He cleaned his rifle, he ate his meals, he slept. He did not speak much about what he had done, partly because the men around him had done things of equal weight and similarly found no language adequate, and partly because the specific arithmetic of what he had done, the exact number of men whose deaths his rifle had affected, was not something he had an inclination to enumerate. He wrote a letter home to Harlan County that his family kept. In it, he mentioned that the war was over, that he expected to be home before winter, that the food in the Philippines was strange but adequate, and that he was well. He did not mention the rifle. He did not mention Bougainville. He wrote 3 paragraphs about the weather and asked about the garden. This was not suppression. It was proportion. The same proportion that had made him a good sniper. The ability to see clearly what mattered and to not inflate it, extended to his accounting of his own experience. He had done a job. The job had been done. He was coming home. The Army processed his separation from service at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in October 1945. The separation papers listed his primary specialty as rifleman. His secondary specialty, which a clerk had to look up in the classification manual because it was rarely written, was listed as sniper. The clerk had remarked, apparently, that he had never seen that particular specialty code before. Givens had said nothing, signed his papers, collected his discharge pay. He was home in Harlan County by Halloween. Expansion. What Givens knew. In the spring of 1967, a Vietnam veteran named Corporal James Aldrich attended a competitive long-range match at a range in Virginia and found himself shooting next to an older man whose form on the line was unusual in a specific way. He was extraordinarily still. Not the practiced stillness of a competitive shooter managing his technique, but something more organic. The stillness of a man for whom the management of movement was so deeply habituated that it had ceased to require conscious management. Aldrich watched the man shoot, 5 shots at 600 yards. The group, confirmed at the target, he ran just under 3 inches. The rifle was an old bolt-action Springfield with a scope that Aldrich, who knew his optics, recognized as a Lyman Alaskan, a design that had been superseded by more modern optics for at least 15 years. At the line, Aldrich introduced himself. The older man gave his name, Raymond Givens, Harlan County, Kentucky. They talked for a while the way people talk at shooting ranges, about the wind, about the light, about the particular character of the afternoon that made judgment calls difficult. Aldrich, back from his second tour and carrying the specific knowledge that Vietnam had added to his skills, eventually asked about the rifle, the Springfield, the Lyman Alaskan. Givens said he had carried it a while. Aldrich asked where. Pacific, Givens said. Bougainville, Philippines. Aldrich was 24 years old. He had been taught to shoot by Marines who had been taught by men who had, in some cases, served in the Pacific. The tradition had passed, imperfectly, through the years of institutional neglect and retrieval. He recognized, without fully knowing the name or the specific story, that he was talking to someone who had been near the beginning of something. They shot the afternoon out. Givens's group at 600 yards, 5 rounds, Lyman Alaskan on a Springfield that was over 20 years old, was 2.8 inches. Aldrich's group, with a pre-64 Model 70 and a modern unertl, was 2.6 inches. Aldrich said the rifles were close. Givens said, the rifle was never the point. He said it without emphasis, looking downrange at the target frames, and didn't elaborate further. And Aldrich thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. He thought about it in the context of everything the sniper program had argued over and spent resources on and delayed and finally resolved. The equipment debates, the doctrine arguments, the scope quality charts and the procurement memoranda, and the field manual revisions. All of it had been, in some organizational sense, arguments about the rifle. What caliber, what action, what optic, what manufacturer. The rifle was never the point. The point was the man behind it, the patience, the education of the eye, the wind call made from accumulated experience rather than calculation. The decision, made in the second before the trigger moved, about whether the shot was right. These things could not be manufactured. They could not be standardized. They could not be procured from a commercial supplier or specified in a field manual or delivered in a 6-week training program, however well designed. They accumulated over time in individuals who took the process seriously and who had the particular combination of aptitude and character that the process required. The institution could create the conditions for this to happen. It could maintain the programs, provide the equipment, develop the doctrine, offer the training. It could refuse to do these things, as it had for significant periods, and pay the consequences in a specific, countable way. But the thing itself, the skill, the patience, the accumulated knowledge that made one shooter reliably better than another at distances where the difference between hitting and missing was measured in inches, this was not institutional, and it was individual. The American military had taken, from 1918 to roughly 1966, almost 50 years to build an institution capable of reliably producing individuals with that quality. The rifle they had mocked, the bolt action, the hunting gun, the relic, the museum piece, the old bolt gun that Lieutenant Warfield had named with bemused dismissal, had been demonstrating the point throughout. Expansion, the numbers that mattered. Precision rifle engagement statistics from the Second World War are, by the standards of modern combat documentation, fragmentary and inconsistent. The American military did not maintain systematic records of individual sniper engagements in the Pacific theater with anything approaching the rigor that a later generation's doctrine would prescribe. What statistics exist were compiled from unit records, field reports, intelligence summaries, and post-war historical interviews, each source with its own limitations. Within those limitations, some figures are meaningful. American snipers in the Pacific theater operated at confirmed engagement ranges, averaging approximately 400 yards, with the distribution extending from under 100 yards, the close terrain of jungle fighting, to above 800 yards, in the more open terrain of northern Luzon and the larger Philippine island geography. The 400-yard average represented the intersection of capability and opportunity. At longer ranges, Pacific jungle terrain limited sight lines. At shorter ranges, a sniper's position was more easily located and engaged in return. At the stop-fire rate, the proportion of observed targets engaged who did not return fire or initiate movement suggesting they were still capable of action was tracked in some units and estimated in others. Among the trained snipers for whom records exist, this figure ran between 70 and 85%. Among the untrained marksmen who had been informally designated as snipers without formal instruction, it ran between 35 and 50%. The difference was not primarily attributable to marksmanship skill. Basic infantry qualification standards ensured that most soldiers could hit a man-sized target at 300 yards under ideal conditions. The difference was wind estimation, range estimation, target selection, and the decision-making that distinguished a shot that should be taken from a shot that should be passed. And these were the skills that training programs built. These were the skills that the abbreviated American programs of 1943 and 1944 built incompletely. These were the skills that a comprehensive program, 6 to 8 weeks, with proper instruction in observation, fieldcraft, and the applied mathematics of external ballistics, built more reliably. The gap between 50% and 80% first shot effectiveness, expressed in lives over the course of a 4-year Pacific campaign, was not a statistic that appeared in any contemporary document. The arithmetic required to produce it involved counterfactuals. What would have happened if the American sniper program had been more developed, better equipped, more systematically supported, that military planners were not, in the middle of a global war, in a position to pursue? And the arithmetic was real. The number of lives it represented was real. It remained, and remains, uncomputed. Raymond Givens' 85% first shot effectiveness rate, estimated from the field reports and confirmed engagements attributed to him, placed him at the upper edge of Pacific theater performance. He achieved this rate with a Weaver 330C scope for the first year and a Lyman Alaskan for the remainder, with a 1903 A4 whose trigger had never been properly adjusted, in a program that had given him 3 weeks of formal training and then largely left him to develop the rest through operational experience. What a 6-week program, a Model 70, and an unearthed scope might have produced is a question that his record, and similar records from the small number of men who achieved comparable results with inadequate institutional support, that allows you to frame. The answer is implicit in the question. Expansion, the doctrine that outlasted the rifles. The Scout Sniper School that Captain Jim Land established at Da Nang in 1966 trained its first class in conditions that were themselves a kind of institutional metaphor. Improvised facilities, limited resources, the organizational weight of a military establishment that was still, in some institutional pockets, running its 1943 ambivalence about whether this was a serious military capability or an expensive hobby. Land did not have time for ambivalence. Vietnam's terrain and the specific character of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army operations created a sniper requirement that was immediate, specific, and visible in daily casualty reports. The enemy used precision fire effectively. And the question was whether the Americans would develop an effective counter and an effective parallel capability, or whether the conversation would proceed through another iteration of the same cycle that had repeated since 1918. Land's program broke the cycle. Not immediately. Institutional change is never immediate, but with a permanence that the previous programs had not achieved. The Da Nang School produced trained snipers who performed in ways that generated internal advocates within the Marine Corps hierarchy. Those advocates pushed the program upward. The program found resources. The resources produced more snipers. The snipers produced results. The results were documented with a rigor that previous programs had not required because no one had been watching closely enough to require it. By 1968, the Marine Corps sniper program was producing first-shot hit rates at 600 yards that exceeded 80% under field conditions. The rifles were the pre-1964 Model 70 and the new M40. The scopes were unertls. The training was 6 weeks of systematic instruction covering everything that Haskell had tried to teach in 3 weeks in 1943 and everything else that 2 wars' worth of operational experience had added to the body of knowledge. The Army's process was slower and arrived later. The Army Sniper School at Fort Benning would not reach its mature form until the 1980s. But by the end of Vietnam, the institutional argument had been settled. Not in theory, in practice, measured in results that 2 decades of progressively better programs had produced. The programs that followed, through the Falklands, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, built on this foundation. Each conflict added specific lessons. Extended ranges in Afghanistan's mountain terrain pushed equipment and training toward capabilities that 1943 could not have imagined. Urban operations in Iraq required the adaptation of doctrine developed for open terrain to 3-dimensional environments where range and trajectory calculations included multiple floors, glass angles, and moving vehicles. The fundamentals held. The technology extended the range over which those fundamentals applied. The M2010, enhanced sniper rifle, adopted by the Army in 2011, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, with the first focal plane scope and a suppressor standard, could reliably engage targets at ranges that would have been theoretical to Givens, with his 1903 A4 and Lyman Alaskan. But the Recon Scout snipers who carried it had received training that bore the direct institutional lineage of the Da Nang School. Land's program codified and improved and passed through the hands of every generation of military marksmen since 1966. The lineage went further back than that. It went back to Haskell on a training range in 1943, telling a group of young men that any man could pull a trigger and a sniper decided which trigger to pull. It went back to Tatum at Camp Lejeune, holding the 1903 A4 at arm's length and telling Givens that the rifle would do exactly what he made it do. It went back to the competitive shooters at Camp Perry who kept the knowledge alive through the decades when the institutions had let it lapse. It went back, in a specific and traceable way, west to the German snipers on the Western Front in 1916 who had demonstrated, in the most direct possible terms, what a skilled man with a scoped rifle could accomplish. The demonstration had taken 100 years to produce its full institutional response. The rifle had never changed. Expansion. The shot and the silence. To understand what a sniper does that an ordinary rifleman does not, you have to understand the specific mathematics of patience. A trained infantry squad, in an assault on a defended position, generates an enormous volume of fire. The assault members fire their weapons rapidly, 8 rounds from an M1 Garand in the time it takes to sprint 20 yards. The trigger worked as fast as the hand can cycle it, the muzzle pointed in the general direction of the problem. That the purpose of this fire is not primarily to hit specific targets. It is to suppress to force the defending force to keep their heads down, to disrupt their aim, to create the conditions under which the assault can close to decisive range. Volume fire works. The theory is sound. The Second World War's infantry doctrine was built on this foundation, and the M1 Garand was the weapon that made it work better than any bolt-action rifle could. The sniper's purpose was categorically different. A sniper did not suppress. A sniper selected. Specific human beings from among all the human beings present in a given sector were identified as targets whose elimination would produce effects disproportionate to a single casualty. The forward observer who was directing artillery fire, at the signals operator whose radio maintained communication between separated units, the engineering officer whose specific knowledge of a bridge's load capacity was operationally essential, the machine gun crew's number one man, whose elimination would reduce the weapon to its backup operator, with a corresponding reduction in rate and accuracy of fire while the position reorganized. These were not random targets. They were chosen. The choice required observation. The time spent watching a position before a shot was taken, identifying not just who was there, but who among those present was most consequential. It required patience that ran counter to every instinct that combat conditions induced. The natural human response to being shot at was to shoot back. A sniper's response was to lie still, to watch, and to wait for the right moment and the right target and the right conditions, and to fire one carefully selected shot whose effect was specific, immediate, and quantifiable. Raymond Givens, in the creek bed on Bougainville, had watched his target for approximately 20 minutes before firing. 20 minutes in a creek, in Pacific humidity, with water flowing past his legs and the weight of a rifle held motionless against a bank that offered no formal shooting rest. 20 minutes in which he identified the target, confirmed the identification through the scope, read the wind through the movement of vegetation, estimated the range by reference to known features he had identified during the previous evening's map study, calculated the holdover from a mental table he had memorized in a training tent in North Carolina, and then waited until the target was stationary, and the wind was manageable, and the light was adequate, and everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Then he fired. This process, observation, identification, calculation, patience, decision, execution, was not amenable to the kind of institutional metrics that military organizations use to evaluate capability. You could not measure patience in a training evaluation. You could not certify a man's ability to lie still in water for 20 minutes by asking him about it. You could test it in training environments designed to do exactly that. And the 6-week programs that eventually emerged from the institutional evolution of the sniper school concept did test it explicitly, that with practical exercises in field observation and concealed movement that revealed whether a man had the specific aptitude the role required. The 3-week programs of 1943 did not have time for this. They taught marksmanship, taught the basics of camouflage, taught enough fieldcraft to give a trained rifleman the foundation for what he would learn in the field. The rest, the patience, the specific knowledge of when to fire and when to hold, the accumulated feel for wind at 500 yards and 600 yards that made the difference between a first-round hit and a miss that compromised the position, this came from operational experience. Men like Givens got that experience because they survived the early operations where the incomplete training left them more exposed than a better prepared program would have. Some did not survive. Yet the men who did not survive also contributed to the institutional knowledge in the negative space of their absence. In the field reports that said a trained sniper had been compromised and killed at a range where better concealment training might have prevented the exposure, these losses were counted. Over time, with enough of them, they were understood. The 6-week program was the institutional response to enough counted losses. 20 minutes in a creek, followed by 1 shot, followed by 3 more hours of motionless waiting to confirm the position was not compromised. This was what the program was eventually designed to produce. It produced it. The men who came through the mature program, who had been properly trained and properly equipped and sent to war with the institutional support that the rifle and the skill deserved, and achieved first-round hit rates and maintained operational security at rates that vindicated every memorandum and every field report and every individual voice that had been saying since 1942 that this was worth doing right. Haskell was right. Tatum was right. The competitive shooters at Camp Perry were right. Anderson was right. Land was right. They were right for 50 years before the institution agreed. Expansion, the weight of the rifle. The 1903 A4 weighed 9 pounds, 8 ounces with the Weaver. 3.3 OC, mounted and unloaded, with 10 rounds of .30-06. Ammunition in a canvas pouch and the cleaning kit that Givens carried in a cut-down section of GI mess kit secured to his belt. The total load attributable to the sniper system was approximately 11.5 pounds. By comparison, the M1 Garand issued to the rest of the battalion weighed 9 pounds, 8 ounces unloaded, with a fixed integral N-block clip that held 8 rounds. Loaded with a full complement of ammunition and standard belt pouches, the Garand system's comparable load ran approximately the same. The weight difference between the two systems was negligible. The practical difference between them, for a man spending 19 hours in the field on a specific mission, was everything. The Garand semi-automatic action was designed for the assault, for the close-range dynamics of a fire and movement engagement, where the ability to place 8 rounds on a target in 2 seconds was the defining characteristic. In that context, the Garand was exactly right. Brilliant, even. So the mechanical innovation that gave every American infantryman that capability was a genuine tactical advantage at the close ranges where most infantry fighting occurred. The 1903 A4's bolt action required the shooter to work a bolt between each shot, a process that took approximately 0.8 seconds in trained hands. At the ranges where Givens operated, 400 to 620 yards, with no quick follow-up shot available without revealing position, this was not a disadvantage. It was irrelevant. He was not firing second shots from the same position. He was firing one shot, confirming the effect, and leaving. The single-shot capability of the bolt action, paradoxically, was sufficient for the specific role. More significantly, the bolt action's mechanical design allowed scope mounting in the conventional position, above the receiver, centered on the bore axis, without the complications that the Garand's operating system imposed. The scope picture was symmetric. The eye relief was consistent. The zero held across a wider range of ammunition variations than the offset-mounted Garand variants would later demonstrate. These were technical arguments. Givens would not have made them in technical language. What he knew, practically, was that the rifle he carried did what he needed it to do, and that the argument about whether he should be carrying it had been made by people who had not done what he was doing with it. He carried it for 2.5 years in the Pacific. He carried it home. He kept it under his bed for a decade. He shot it competitively for 30 years after that. It grew 2.75 inches at 400 yards, 70 years after it was made. The argument was never really about the rifle. Expansion. The men who carried the tradition. Between 1945 and 1966, the practical knowledge of American military sniping was maintained not by institutions, but by individuals. Haskell, discharged in 1946, went back to Wyoming and guided elk hunters in the Absaroka Range for the rest of his working life. He carried a pre-war Model 70 and .30-06. His clients, who paid significant money to hunt with a man who could read terrain at distances that strained their binoculars, were occasionally told, in the specific language of a man who had learned it operationally, about wind calls and holdover and the patience required to make a distant shot correctly. Most of them attributed it to hunting expertise. It was hunting expertise. It was also everything he had taught in a training tent in 1943. Tatum stayed in the Marines. He taught on the marksmanship ranges at Quantico through the 1950s. The program he worked within was limited. The institutional commitment that the post-Vietnam generation would establish had not yet arrived. But within those limits, he taught what he knew, to the men who passed through, with the specificity of someone who understood what could be lost if it was not passed on. When the Da Nang School was established in 1966, several of the men who helped Land develop the curriculum had, at some point in their training histories, been instructed by or alongside Marines who had learned from Tatum or men like him. The chain was not documented. It did not need to be. Anderson left the Army in 1952 and spent the following decade as a defense contractor, working on weapons procurement specifications with a background that informed his understanding of what the specifications needed to say. His memoranda and field reports from the war years were archived in records that historians would not systematically examine for another 2 decades. The arguments he had made in 1943 and 1944 about the equipment and the doctrine and the program that should have existed were vindicated by the program that eventually did exist. He did not live to see the mature form. He died in 1961, but the institutional path from his memos to the Da Nang curriculum was, in retrospect, a straight line drawn through 2 decades of gradual institutional acceptance. At the competitive shooting community at Camp Perry and at ranges across the country, maintained the marksmanship tradition with a persistence that had nothing to do with military utility and everything to do with the specific satisfaction that precision shooting produces in people constituted to appreciate it. These shooters, many of them veterans, many of them not, all of them people for whom the particular challenge of placing a bullet exactly where it was intended at distances where the physics were demanding represented something worth pursuing, kept the technical knowledge current. The development of better scopes, better cartridges, better stocks, and trigger mechanisms through the 1950s and 1960s happened primarily in the civilian market, driven by the competitive shooting and hunting community's demand for equipment that was better than what was currently available. When the military finally arrived at a serious equipment acquisition program in the mid-1960s, the civilian market had already done most of the development work. The Model 70 was waiting. The Unertl was waiting. The match-grade .30-06 and .308 ammunition was waiting. The gunsmiths who knew how to select and fit and tune these systems were waiting. The institution had taken its time. The tradition had not waited. Aftermath. The disruption of Japanese artillery observation on Bougainville that followed Gibbons's November 1943 engagement lasted, by intelligence assessment, approximately 4 days before the Japanese replaced their forward observer and re-established accurate fire. But the 4 days were operationally significant. American forces used the window to consolidate supply positions that had been under harassment, moving material that the restored Japanese fire would have been able to interdict. The value of this consolidation in lives and operational continuity was real, if incapable of precise quantification. Within the 3rd Marine Division and the attached Army elements, the engagement was discussed informally, soldier to soldier, in the way that notable events in the field become part of a unit's shared knowledge. The man with the bolt-action rifle, the man who had been called eccentric and old-fashioned and practically obsolete, had done something that no amount of volume fire from M1 Garands had accomplished in 9 days of operations, and this did not immediately change minds about the rifle or the program at the leadership level. But it planted something, a specific memory, an example that a few officers carried with them as they progressed through the war and eventually through careers that would allow them to influence doctrine. Gibbons himself was notified of his Bronze Star by letter several months after the events it cited. He was in the field at the time of notification and had to wait for a supply-resupply run to collect the physical medal. He wore it on his uniform for the remainder of the war. He kept it in a shoebox after returning home. His 1903 A4 and Lyman-Alaskan combination was tested by the nephew who inherited it in the late 1980s on a range in eastern Kentucky, with modern match-grade ammunition. At 400 yards, in the rifle group, 5 shots inside 2.75 inches. The scope's reticle was sharp. The mechanism functioned without hesitation. Whatever had gone into the manufacturing of that particular rifle and that particular scope, the specific combination of metal and glass and accumulated care, had survived the decades intact. A relic, a museum piece, a bolt-action hunting rifle in a war of semi-automatic infantry weapons. It shot 2.75 inches at 400 yards, 70 years after it was made. Sometimes that's the whole story. Historical legacy. The institutional evolution of the American military sniper program between 1918 and 1970 produced consequences that extended beyond the programs themselves into fundamental questions about how military organizations learn. The sniper experience offered a case study in a specific institutional failure: the tendency of large military organizations to discard specialized knowledge between conflicts, to dismiss individual expertise that doesn't fit existing categorical structures, and to resist capability development when that development requires acknowledging that an existing approach has been inadequate. The lessons of the First World War's sniper campaigns were available in 1918. They were not retained. The lessons of the Second World War's early Pacific and North African campaigns were available in 1942. They were retained more slowly and at cost. The Marine Corps' development of the Da Nang Scout Sniper School in 1966 was more than a training institution. It was an explicit acknowledgement that specialized skills required specialized preparation, and that the preparation had to be systematic, rigorous, and institutionally valued. Not tolerated as an eccentricity, but supported as a capability. The school established standards. Standards created a community of practice. A community of practice produced institutional memory that could survive the end of a conflict and the demobilization that followed. The Army followed with its own programs, eventually establishing the Special Operations Target Interdiction Course and the Sniper School at Fort Benning, which produced the first modern Army sniper doctrine that was comprehensive, continuously updated, and institutionally respected. The rifle question was resolved by the evolution of purpose-built sniper systems, the M24, the M107, at the CSASS. That acknowledged what the pre-1964 Winchester Model 70 had demonstrated and the 1903 A4 had approximated. That precision marksmanship required precision equipment, and that precision equipment was worth the procurement effort and the training investment. Modern American military snipers operate with equipment, training, and institutional support that would have seemed miraculous to Raymond Givens, lying in a creek on Bougainville in 1943. The variables are better understood. The optics gather light that would have been darkness to a Weaver 330C. The rifles, in a good modern sniper system, deliver first-round hits at distances that exceed anything the Second World War programs could have contemplated. The fundamentals are the same: the patience, the stillness, but the wind call made up from observation and experience, and the accumulated weight of shots taken and missed, and taken again until the reading becomes reliable. Those fundamentals were true in 1943. They are true now. They were true before there were scopes or rifles or a United States of America to issue them. What changed was whether the institution was willing to acknowledge it. Final reflection. At 0612 hours on November 2nd, 1943, in a cane field on Bougainville, a 22-year-old man with a bolt-action rifle that half his battalion had already written off as a museum piece made a 620-yard shot under conditions that required everything he had learned and some things that could not be taught. The institutions that had issued him that rifle had resisted it, argued against it, failed to document what he did with it, and then neglected to properly recognize what it was worth. The rifle didn't care. It shot. Call to action. If this story stayed with you, If the image of one quiet man and one bolt-action rifle holds weight in your mind, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the corners of military history that the official records passed over. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.